In our last activity, we used maps to examine racial residential segregation. Today, we'll connect what we learned from those maps to a broader question about the political origins of wealth inequality. By the end of class, you'll be able to trace the political origins of racial wealth inequality, and you'll be able to link these origins to data science questions that involve a unit of analysis, a set of predictors, and an outcome variable. I'd like to start by taking us back in history to the Great Depression. This was a difficult economic time in America. We had been in a period of economic prosperity in the 1920s, but in the 1930s, jobs seemed to disappear and lots of people were struggling. Within this context, Franklin Delano Roosevelt began signing lots of bills to help the economy recover and put Americans back to work. So he signed bill after bill after bill. One of those bills focused on difficulties with home ownership. This bill started the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which later transformed into the Federal Housing Administration. The Homeowners Loan Corporation solved one particular problem. In 1933, roughly half of American mortgages were in default. So the Hulk came in to try to save those mortgages. They faced this question: who is eligible? The federal government was going to offer this backing to mortgages to help people not lose their homes. But they had to decide which homes would be eligible for this kind of federal backing. Now, of course, the people were all a little bit unreliable here because their jobs were not steady. And so the government decided that instead of focusing on the people, they would also consider the place in which the home was located. So the agency rated neighborhoods. They rated them from most desirable, A, to most undesirable, D. And they did this in an explicitly racist fashion. Neighborhoods that had low-income immigrants, they got D ratings. And neighborhoods that had black families, they got D ratings. It's almost hard to believe today that this was so explicitly the policy of the administration, but it was. If you want to read more about this, there are many resources that can take you through the history of this politically motivated racial segregation. So here are some of the maps. This is an image of St. Louis, and you can see that each neighborhood is outlined and filled in with a color. Some neighborhoods are green, those were the desirable ones, and others are red. We refer to this process as redlining because there's a red shape placed on top of the neighborhoods that were excluded from the backing of mortgages. By one estimate, in St. Louis there were about 94,030 African American residents, and this map placed 0 of those residents outside of red areas. So it's not a stretch to say that even a few African American families was enough to make a neighborhood be coded red. Here's what it looked like in Buffalo, here is Chicago, and here's Los Angeles. So throughout the country, neighborhoods were mapped, and those that were in certain neighborhoods got mortgage backing, and those that were not in those neighborhoods didn't get mortgage backing. So from 1933 to 1934, the Homeowners Loan Corporation gave out roughly $3 billion of loans. These went out to 1 in 10 non-farm owner-occupied homes. So it was a massive policy. But it was short-lived. This was just in the heart of the Depression. You might think that its consequences in the future would be limited, because after all, the policy only went through 1934. But in fact, that was not the end of these types of policies. You see, in the Depression, we entered a new phase of government intervention. We came to expect that the government would be in the business of backing home mortgages, and that carried on into the future. In the 1950s through 1960s, for instance, the suburbs boomed. And who had access to these suburbs? It was people who were able to secure a mortgage. At this point, Holk had ended, but the Federal Housing Administration, it continued, and in fact, it maintained this mapping policy, so that people could only get a mortgage if the neighborhood where that home was located had a good rating in the Federal Housing Administration map. And so you might now ask yourself, well, how did communities and homeowners respond to this federal policy? Remember that if there were more diverse people in the neighborhood, that neighborhood might now get mapped in a way where it wouldn't be eligible for mortgages. And this could be bad for home values in that neighborhood because people couldn't buy in that neighborhood without the federal backing. And so local organizations furthered these federal racist policies. This is an image from the Blue Ridge community, which started in the 1930s just outside of Seattle. And they had these racial covenants. So explicitly in the policies of this homeowners association, It said that no addition here shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased, in whole or in part, to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. So this continued until the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Fair Housing Act really changed things. So instead of the federal government furthering racist policies and encouraging local organizations to further their own racist policies in addition, the Fair Housing Act said that there would no longer be discrimination in the sale of residential housing on the basis of race and several other protected characteristics. The Fair Housing Act is the basis of today's policies of equal housing opportunity, where there are important protections in place to make sure that people are able to purchase homes no matter their race. But enforcement was difficult, so it was not immediately the case that homes became open to people of all races. In the video linked here, which we watched in class, Senator Cory Booker tells the story of how his parents moved into a neighborhood in New Jersey. When they looked at a home, they were told that the home was actually no longer on the market. Because they were working with some lawyers seeking to promote equal opportunity, the lawyers sent a white family to follow up and visit the home. And that family was told that the home was available. And so they actually went through with the sale as though it was the white family buying the home. And at the end, Senator Booker's parents came and were the ones who actually bought the house. So in some cases, fair housing happened. But that took a lot of people working together, and in many cases, fair housing was still not happening in practice. In addition, to buy a house, you still needed some wealth. And if we think about the historical process here, white families had built wealth over the entire period from the 30s up through the 60s. And so they had the wealth to make a down payment on those houses. Many black families didn't have that wealth because they had been previously excluded from these mortgage backing practices. So white families had their wealth, black families did not. The conclusion of all this is that segregation and racial inequality that was rooted in the 1930s, it persists today. It has its origins in political actions and laws that were passed by the federal government and furthered by local communities. So how could we study this kind of thing with data science? I'm going to give you two examples, one from a published paper in sociology, and one that's not from a published paper but is much more feasible as something you might be able to accomplish in your own final project for this class. So for our published example, we might ask, did the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps cause neighborhoods to become more segregated? This is a paper written by Jacob Faber, who's a sociologist who studies racial segregation and housing. Faber noticed a key empirical fact. Some places were graded by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They had those maps made that I showed you earlier. Other places were not graded by Holk. Now, ostensibly, this should have been determined by a policy. Maps were required for cities that had more than 40,000 people in population. But in practice, there were some cities below this threshold and some above this threshold who were not mapped or mapped, despite what the policy would have suggested. This creates some variation in a predictor that we can use to look at how that variation relates to future segregation outcomes. So it becomes possible to compare two places with similar populations. One place was mapped by Holk, one place was not mapped by Holk. And then we can see whether the maps themselves created further racial segregation. So a key question we first have to answer to do that is to think about how we'll measure segregation. Our unit of analysis here, like a row of the data set, is going to be a place. And we need to define an outcome variable in that place. So in the paper, they're going to consider each place to have several census tracts. So census tracts are like neighborhoods, and within a city, there might be many neighborhoods. One outcome variable out of several studied in the paper is the isolation index. Put in simple terms, the isolation index is as follows. On average, over African American residents in the place, what is the average proportion of people in their census tract who are African American? So the isolation index would take an extreme value of 100% if every African American in the place lived in a census tract that was 100% African American. In a perfectly integrated neighborhood, the isolation index here might take about the value of the percent African American in the city as a whole. So if the city was 30% African American and every African American resident lived in a tract that was 30% African American, The isolation index here would be 30%. Having defined our unit of analysis and our outcome, we can now begin to frame this question similar to how we considered other predictive questions in our class. So here we have a matrix of predictors. Each row is one unit of analysis, a place in a particular year. Then there are 3 predictor variables. Which place is this? What year is it? And was that place ever graded by the homeowner's loan corporation? So place 1 in this hypothetical example was graded by Hulk at some point. So at 1930, we get to see that place before it was graded. In 1950, we see it after it was graded. In this example, place 2 was never graded by Hulk, so in both 1930 and 1950, this place was not graded. Our outcome then is going to be this isolation index that we've just defined. So along the way, there are some sample restrictions. I put these up here just briefly as a reminder that in your own project, it's important to clarify why you've dropped cases from your population. So for instance, in this paper, they dropped cases for various reasons, such as missing values on covariates. Here are some results. So we have 2 lines. One line shows you the predicted black isolation in places that were appraised by the homeowner's loan corporation. This is the dashed line. And in that line, we see that there was some isolation in 1920, 1930, and 1940. And then there was this big jump upward in black isolation as of 1950, which carried on through the end of the series. Meanwhile, in places where the homeowner's loan corporation did not create these maps, black isolation stayed relatively steady through the entire period. This result provides fairly strong evidence that the maps themselves may have caused an increase in black isolation in the places that got appraised by the maps. Example 2. In this example, we'll focus on a much simpler question. The first example was hard because to do this analysis, you'd have to work with geographic data to figure out how to map census tracts onto the other kinds of data sources available. It involved a complicated data set with places observed over time and somewhat tricky data structures. Example 2 will be much more straightforward. Here we'll think about estimating the racial wealth gap in a particular year. In redline neighborhoods, it was hard to sell your homes. It was hard to buy a home, and home prices did not rise. In the suburbs, home ownership skyrocketed in the 1940s through 1960s. Home prices rose as a result, and wealth grew for these families. Here's a book where you could read more about that history. Given this history, we might want to know what the racial gap in median wealth is today. We could answer that question using data that are publicly available online from the Survey of Consumer Finances. So here's a link where you could go and get these data yourself. Using the 2022 SCF, we could define the unit of analysis. We'll have a data set where every row corresponds to an American household. Our key predictor here will be race. Our outcome will be net worth. We're defining that as your assets minus your debts. Finally, we're going to summarize this distribution of net worth by race by the median. So what would we conclude? We would estimate that for white households, the median wealth is $272,000. For black households, the median wealth is $49,590. This is a pretty dramatic ratio. If we took the number for white divided by the number for black, we would conclude that the typical white household has about $5.48 for each $1 held by the typical black household. Now this analysis right here is purely descriptive. It just tells you the number. It demonstrates that there is a massive gap between the wealth of black and white households. Paired with the historical story that we have just told, you can see how this gap may have origins in racist policies that affected which families were able to buy houses and how those house purchases might have led to growing wealth in one subgroup where another subgroup was excluded from those opportunities. So here's a slide with some additional resources if you'd like to learn more about racial wealth inequality and residential segregation. Our learning goals today were to trace the political origins of racial wealth inequality and to link these to data science questions. We talked about one data science example that was a little bit complicated, but traced an important story. Then we talked about another example that was fairly straightforward, where you could go get the data yourself. And in an hour or two, you could probably produce the results that we produced. As we move forward in the course, we look forward to seeing what you'll come up with as your research questions to answer for the final course project.